Haven't made a video in a while, have I? What's up? It's Matt. How are you doing, my friends? I am here to talk about books and stuff. This is my personal channel apart from Polyglot Progress, where I talk about languages with Abigail. And so over here I get to do whatever I want, and I have been having some difficulty in the past few months trying to decide how I want to go about making videos on here. I've been putting a lot of pressure on myself to do like full-style essay stuff, and I'm trying to find some intermediary between actual essay, video essay, and then just kind of talk video vlog thing. And we're gonna see how today goes. I want to talk about the Oulipo. If you don't know about the Oulipo, that's understandable because I feel like their work is mainly in French, and it is only now kind of making an appearance in American circles, I think, and or maybe in the 70s also, but they are a French group of poets active from 1963 onward, and basically the word Oulipo comes from the words in French l'oeuvre de la littérature potentielle, which is the workshop of potential literature. And there exists not only the Oulipo, there exists the other Oulipos for other arts, which are called Oulipo, such as the Ubapo, which is potential cartooning. There's the Upenpo, which is painting, the Utrapo, which is tragicomedy, and the Ucarpo, which is potential cartography. And onward, there are potentially endless potential art forms, which I love. And so what does it mean to have potential literature is a question I can understand you asking. And just so everyone's aware, I'm mainly going to be talking about this collection of essays edited by Ian Monk and Daniel Evan Becker, who are two Oulipians themselves, and I believe it's published on behalf of the Oulipo, and it's their first collected essays in English, as far as I'm aware. I will have a link to this down below if you're interested. I will be mainly quoting from here. I think one way of defining potential literature would be creating art through the imposition of restraints or defined rules that are potentially arbitrary, probably are arbitrary, and creating meaningful, coherent work through that process. Coherency is really where it comes from. Meaning comes from the coherency, I think. And I think the point of Oulipo is that there is what is called infraordinary, and that through the ordinary you can come to some really profound stuff. The Oulipo use techniques which basically heighten the ordinary of literature and reveal the ordinary within preset texts and kind of subvert them as they go through it. And I'll get into some examples of this as we go along. So like I was just saying, there's a quote by Duchateau, which is, "Oulipians subject themselves to arbitrary constraints and remain bound to them." This is what's most important about the Oulipo. It's remaining within the rule sets you define for yourself. Arbitrary in the sense that we are obeying not general laws adopted based on experience or habitude, but rules whose validity is decided as a function of the set in question. This is what interests us. A certain number of solutions is in a given field. The field is a structure. The wider the field, the more solutions, and vice versa. The notion that a structure must be average to be good is meaningless. The structure must be coherent. And one of these fields or structures you have likely heard of is the N7 method, or the W plus or minus N method. It's considered by the Oulipo a relatively mundane method at this point. It's been it's one of the most widely used ones that you've probably heard of without knowing it was even associated with the Oulipo. And so Lescure describes it in this book as allowing practically infinite applications in the same text. And it's later defined as isosyntaxism, which is a really cool term, by Noel Arnault. I'm going to stick with the N+7 method because that's honestly one of the most easy to convey the idea of. So the N7 method is basically you take a relatively short poem or a guide to how your microwave works or a vacuum instruction manual, and you take any text whatsoever, select the section of it you'd like to translate or manipulate, and then you go through each word procedurally and you get to the word, say the word is paradise, and then you will go to the dictionary, find the word paradise. Paradise is a noun. you will go 7 nouns up or down from it. If it's n plus 7, you'll go up, and minus 7, you go down, or backwards, forward. Basically, the idea of this is that you can create potentially limitless possibilities of a single poem just by using this method and by applying various constraints to it, and that's what the W plus or minus n means. It allows practically infinite applications on the same text, and this is what's referred to as isosyntaxism. And so it's really neat. Also, when I mentioned the word infraordinary before, that's a term that I think comes about based on Georges Perec, who he wrote the book An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in Paris, I think that's the title of it, where he basically for 3 days came back to the same spot, Place Sainte-Marie, I don't remember, and he basically would attempt to document everything that is normally not documented. So for 1 day, he's basically documenting bus schedules, or like the buses he sees go by, fragments of text that he sees appear, what each shop does, the weather, and like he'll note like, okay, I'm getting bored of buses, let's do something else. And this constitutes the body of the poem simply by doing this. So I recently saw some chapbook that was released called An Attempt at Exhausting a Place in GTA Online, I think, which I think is really funny. Haven't read it yet. But the N7 method is a really good starter point for like just kind of what it means to think in Oulipian terms, of kind of seeing other options in place of a text. The idea that what is there is potential, and that what is not there, it also exists in potential. I think one really good example of this is Raymond Queneau's, what's it called, 100 Million Poems? Because this is one of like the founding texts of Oulipo. Also, Queneau is one of the like gods of the Oulipo. That's a bad way to put it, but you know what I mean. 100,000 billion poems, my apologies. And so basically, if I can think of it correctly, it's that each line of, they're all sonnets, I believe, and each line of the sonnet exists on like a page by itself that can like flip and you can view the next line below, or like the poems are kind of interchangeable is the idea. Their parts flow into one another and create coherent poems. No matter what order you read them in, the syntax flows and the idea is intelligible no matter what. Something really neat about Queneau doing this is he kind of created in this a kind of microcosm of the infinite poem, and in response to this there came about, and it's documented in here, theorizing about the zero poem, or the poem with no content in it, which is like, it's cool how the Oulipo go in two directions of like fitting everything you can in a poem and then reducing it to nothing, which potentially holds everything in it. And so in the book, actually, there exists a portion which I think attempts to do what Perec did with a space, but doing it in time and movement. So that's I'm referring to the infraordinary aspect of it, and it's by, I think, Valérie Baudouin. And the note before the piece begins is that it mixes commuter life and the procedural urban railway poetry of the Poème de Métro with the patient place-based observational approach Georges Perec took in his attempt at exhausting a place in Paris, an exercise in discerning the infraordinary currents just beneath the surface of daily life. So this one's really neat because what Valérie is doing is taking the same path on this train during the AM and the PM of their day, and noting different things by solely using pronouns and verbs. Pronoun, verb, noun is the kind of structure of it. And then there's a further external structure that decides how the poem itself is structured. So it goes PM, AM, AM, PM, PM, AM, AM, PM, PM, AM, weekend, etc. And so to give you an example of the first poem, and these change as it goes on, there are caesuras that happen, there are blanks that I believe act as like kind of metrical rests. There are really neat movements that happen in this, there are interludes that happen. It kind of becomes gradually metatextual, and other stuff happens. But I'll just read to you the first, the first section that is quoted here, which is PM northbound. He reads the paper, he listens to music, He reads a book. He reads a book. He looks at his watch. She reads a magazine. He fiddles with his phone. She reads the paper. She reads a magazine. He sleeps, hands crossed on his bag. He holds his paper, eyes closed. She holds a book, looks ahead. He reads the paper. She flips through a magazine. And this only referring to people using pronouns and verbs, which the majority, I think the most frequent verb in this poem is reads, which is interesting. As I said, it becomes increasingly metatextual. It does get increasingly more detailed, and it in the kind of lack of defining features of these people, which are just commuters who the author supposedly sees every day, is that they do kind of blend into the same character based on the actions and the nouns associated with them. And so this is just one example of like the infraordinary, which I think is really interesting. This is a notion I think I'll discuss further with the language poets who I want to talk about, like Ron Silliman, Lynn Haginian, etc. But yeah, so, and this poem, like I said, it's based on the idea of the metro poem, which I would like to talk about. Yeah, something neat about Oulipians is they will sometimes ask their friends, their fellow Oulipians, to design constraints for them. And what this means is basically, one example of what this means is that Jacques Jouet, went to his friend Pierre Rosenstiel, and asked him to design a map of the Paris metro for him that he would follow and write a subway poem while following. And if I go to 149, I can read to you Pierre Rosenstiel's subway poem describing how you write a subway poem. So I'm gonna read you this. This is Pierre Rosenstiel's Frieze of the Paris metro. And so, like I said, he will then go on to detail how he created the map and kind of constraint for Jacques Jouet, whose poem follows this, and it's really neat. From time to time, I write metro poems, this poem being an example. Do you want to know what a metro poem consists of? Let's suppose you do. Here, then, is what a metro poem consists of. A metro poem is a poem composed during a journey in the metro. There are as many lines in a metro poem as there are stations in your journey, -1. The first line is composed mentally between the first 2 stations of your journey, counting the station you got on at. It is then written down when the train stops at the second station. The second line is composed mentally between the second and the third stations of your journey. It is then written down when the train stops at the third station, and so on. You must not write anything down when the train is moving. You must not compose when the train has stopped. The poem's last line is written down on the platform of the last station. If your journey necessitates one or more changes of line, the poem will then have 2 or more stanzas. An unscheduled stop between 2 stations is always an awkward moment in the writing of a metro poem. And so what's so neat about the metro poem, in my opinion, is that the stanzaic structure and visual structure of the poem is pre-decided geographically. And so what Rosenstiel has to consider in his mapping out of the Paris metro for Jouet is how many stops Jouet will have to take. He wanted to allow a map that would let Jouet keep moving consistently. What is it? The poet requested that he could stay on the subway between the opening and the closing of the service, and that he shouldn't have to change randomly, so that he could follow a path throughout the entire metro that didn't repeat, I think was the idea. And so this is the map that he comes up with of the Paris metro that Jacques Jouet will follow to compose his metro poem, and then follows the metro poem, which I won't read to you because it's very long, and I believe it exists elsewhere. And interestingly, it says a few months later that Jouet took the same route in reverse, writing a poem in response to this poem. So that's really neat. And I've seen contemporary poets do a lot of this, like people who take commutes, write subway poems. Like I think Ron Silliman wrote one. And something else I want to mention is the etymology of the word Oulipo, and how Oulipo becomes a collaborative activity or a collaborative artistic effort. In the introduction to this book, one of the editors, Daniel Levenbecker, says that mentions that the word ouvroir in L'ouvroir de la littérature potentielle is not only the word for workshop of potential literature, but it also means sewing circle. And I think this is really cool because there's a procedure my friends and I do which we call word Oulipo. This is because we have multiple kinds of Oulipos that we perform together. And what we basically do is we'll gather at the library, spread across the library, gather books based on various topics to heighten the kind of the difference in lexicons which we can potentially draw from. Then we'll reconvene and we establish 3 pieces of paper, which are 3 different poems. To write the poem, one of us on one piece of paper flips to a random page, selects a word, puts it on the paper, passes the paper to the next person. And then they will do the same, responding to the word or diverging from it, punctuating and moving on, etc. Once the paper has left one author's hand and moves to the next, it is that author's property, then it moves to the next, and it's always in a continual state of being responded to and continuing. And what this does is really neat because it kind of heightens the tension between each word at a level that doesn't happen in prose and might not even happen in the typical construction of a poem. You can't entertain or necessarily even consider what the person before you was thinking that would follow the word they just put down, and either way it's influenced by whichever book you then pick up and whatever random page you flip to. Sometimes we'll use number generators. So at the end of this, when we all kind of decide on finishing points for these poems, because they could keep going on forever, we kind of decide a length to stop at. And then we read them aloud and order them. And if the exercise proves worthwhile, we will have created 3 stanzas of a single poem which respond to one another. So this is what we term word Oulipo. I think it does stem from, I think this is in response more so to the sewing circle connotation of the word ouvroir. And I really like that because it does provide a sense of community. The poems can't be created without the act of other people being involved. Of course, you can do word Oulipo by yourself. There are other forms of Oulipo which necessitate one person and then come together. And these are just exercises which we came up with. There are infinitely other Oulipo exercises, and I'm leaving a lot out of this book which we can discuss. And one of the points of Oulipo, which is also quoted by Duchateau early on in the book, is that there is artifice in all language, and Oulipo tries to highlight that artifice, or at least bring attention to it, and point out that it can be interesting and meaningful to either expose or examine the artifice in language, and to come to new forms of meaning and structure thereabouts. For instance, you can come up with some really neat stuff doing the n+7 or n+ whatever. You can do verb -2, you can do adjective +3, adverb -4, etc. So I don't really have much more I want to talk about other than the fact that I think Oulipo deserves some love and attention outside of France. I believe Ian Monk and Daniel Levenbecker are both Americans, or actually I'm not sure. But I'm very grateful to them for having translated all of these, or having at least edited all of these and translated a good bit of them and putting them together in this English edition, because we can finally kind of get to work on them. We're very behind the French, and start thinking about them, theorizing about them. I'm personally really interested in the Oulipo. I think it's very meaningful, and thinking in Oulipian grammars, it does something really interesting to my brain when you have to only think on the level of the word. When I do word Oulipo with my friends, it really does something interesting. We have another form of Oulipo which is called letter Oulipo, in which you take an established poem and you go through it, changing each letter one at a time to form new words. And this itself really does something strange to my brain, because you can't anticipate what the next words form and structural limits will restrict you to. Very strange, really interesting. And yeah, I really recommend looking into Oulipo if you're interested in this kind of stuff, experimental literature. Someone I will likely make my next video on is Italo Calvino. He has a book which I'm sure many people are familiar with called If on a Winter's Night a Traveler, which is written using equations which determine his plot. I will give you a sneak peek of them right now to pique your interest in case you want to read this book before I discuss it on this channel. These are some of the equations which dictate the narrative of a few of the chapters in the book. And it's really neat. I will read to you the first equation. The reader who is there, capital L, is reading the book that is there, cursive L. The book that is there relates the story to the reader who is in the book, capital L apostrophe. The reader who is in the book does not succeed in reading the book in the book, cursive L apostrophe. The book that is there does not relate the story of the reader who is there. The reader who is in the book claims to be the reader who is there. The book that is there claims to be the book that is in the book. And this goes on. Each succeeding chapter adds another equation to it. So chapter 2 has 2, chapter 3 has 3. And this gets perpetually more interesting. These algorithms of narrative are really neat, and I want to talk about them further in another video and relate them to my experience actually reading the book, because you read the book without knowing that these are in place, and then you read this essay and it's insane thinking about it. But that is all. I will see you guys next time. I actually want to leave you with a certain quote from the book. If you are interested in supporting the channel, I currently don't make ad revenue off of this, and I have a Patreon, and I'd like to be doing videos here every week. And if you want to support me on Patreon, that means a lot to me, and if you want to go over to Polyglot Progress, that is also cool, because I am making videos over there. And here is the quote I would like to leave you with today, by Jean Caval. Literature is the largest house. Our research work will be ignored by remarkable literary creators. The Oulipo will not be any weaker for not being imperialistic. In my opinion, amen, and end of parentheses. And I love this quote because the Oulipo is not a militaristic avant-garde movement. They hardly identify as being a movement, and yet this doesn't make them anti-political. In fact, I actually read an article that negates this idea recently, which I can talk about more if you're interested, but I like the idea that it's not imperialistic, and it gives me hope for the art that it creates. So, thank you. And link to the book will be in the description if you're interested. Again, thank you to Ian Monk and Daniel Levenbecker for this edition. It is wonderful, and I appreciate it. So, bye all.